Alright, so this is the conclusion to our coverage of Chapter 3 for Ethnocultural Psychology on critical thinking. Now, when we finished up our last lecture, I had been talking about just words of warning when it comes to interpreting correlation and causation. And so we had talked about the post hoc error, also known as parataxic reasoning. So I'm going to go ahead and skip over that since we've already covered it. But another thing that I wanted to mention is that, well, we've talked about the directionality problem before in correlational research. So that was this notion that when you have a correlation between two variables, you don't know if, like, let's call these variables A and B, you don't know if A caused B or B caused A. Well, another thing that can happen is that you can have something called bidirectional causation, in which causality runs both ways. So you have A causing B and then B influencing A. So this is sometimes what's referred to as a cycle, occasionally referred to as a vicious cycle, although that implies that it's negative. It isn't always necessarily a negative thing, as I'll illustrate in just a second. So for example, one type of cycle that you can see within psychology, psychological processes, is the relationship between self-esteem and one's social relationships. So an individual who has high self-esteem generally acts more friendly toward other people. And as we talked about in our previous lecture, when you treat other people in a friendly way, that can turn into that can play a role in self-fulfilling prophecies, and those people will act more friendly toward you and want to be your friends. Well, there's also a lot of psychological research showing that there's a strong relationship between the number of friends one has and their self-esteem. So the more friends you have, the better the quality of your social relationships, the better your self-esteem. So you can see how this can be a self-repeating cycle that is more positive in nature. There can be negative cycles as well, of course. You've heard of vicious cycles. So one of these more negative examples would be if you look at the relationship between poverty, education, and unemployment. And I've mentioned this briefly before, but if people are born into poverty, then they tend to have fewer educational opportunities. And education is one of the best predictors of employment. So if you have somebody who doesn't have the best opportunities when it comes to education, they're less likely to get a job that pays well, much less any job. And so if you don't have a job and you're unemployed, then it's likely that you'll be poor. And so, again, that's just another example of this bidirectional causation. Also, when we talk about correlations and interpreting correlations, we often just try to simplify it. I know I do, into like one thing possibly causing another. But another thing that can happen is you can have a situation in which there is multiple causation. In fact, this is probably much more realistic than just assuming simple relationships in the real world. So out in the real world, there are lots of different factors that interact with one another to produce any particular outcome. And so you have to take that into account. Anytime you hear a statement that A causes B, like, there might be evidence to that effect, but you can't assume that that one factor was the only causal factor. So another kind of social example of this is obesity. Right? So you hear a lot about the obesity epidemic in America and all these different explanations for why this is such a problem nowadays. But oftentimes people will focus in on one explanation or another. So the most common things that people will talk about are exercise and diet. And granted, those are important factors. So if somebody lives a sedentary lifestyle and has a high calorie intake, then they will be more likely to pack on the pounds. But there are so many other factors that play a role, and it would just not be adequate to focus on one or even two of these factors. So there are other things like genetics, the genetics of metabolism, and how people's bodies react to these different nutrients. Different cultural beliefs regarding what foods are appropriate, what eating styles are appropriate. Different amounts of education that people receive about nutrition and health. That can have a major impact on on people's behavior. And then other factors like socioeconomic status. Sometimes people are kind of limited in their access to quality food. And so they tend to focus more on the cheap calories, which tend to be high in fat, high in carbohydrates, but low in other essential nutrients, which can play a role in the development of obesity. So again, you just have to take this into account, that for any given variable there are lots of things that go into producing that outcome. But the bottom line, of course, for correlation and causation is that you should not assume a causal relationship based purely on correlational data. Now, correlation implies that there might be causation. In fact, you can't have a cause and effect relationship without correlation. That's confusing to a lot of people. But the best way to show a causal relationship is to do a controlled experiment where the researcher manipulates one independent variable, or more than one independent variable, while controlling for other potential factors. And as I've mentioned, for a lot of cultural psychology findings, that's just not possible because you can't randomly assign people to these factors like socioeconomic status, religion, nationality, and so on. So you'll just need to keep this in mind throughout this class when we're talking about these correlational findings or quasi-experimental findings, as I've talked about. And you should also just remember that there are lots of different possible relationships between these factors. So, as I've said, it could be the case that when you have a correlation between two things, like A and B, A causes B. It could be that B causes A. If all you have is a basic correlation, you can't be sure. That's the directionality issue. And then, as I mentioned in this lecture, you could have a multiple causation situation where A and B kind of interact with one another and form one of those cycles or loops. And then you could have that third variable problem where there's some other factor that the researchers didn't even take into account that's simultaneously causing changes in both of the things that made up that correlation coefficient that was initially reported. So just keep that in mind, again, whenever you're trying to decipher some correlational finding. Now, the next thing that I wanted to talk about is something called the naturalistic fallacy. Now, if you think about some of the advertisements that you see and some of the labels that you see on a lot of products in the store, it's not uncommon to see these things marketed as being all natural, 100% natural. So think about what the people who made that product or the people who marketed it are trying to get across there. So when they put this label on there, that's supposed to give the impression that this is good, that it's all natural, there's nothing artificial about it. So why do people tend to have this belief? So, like I said, this is called the naturalistic fallacy. It's also very similar to another philosophical notion called the is-ought fallacy, which is the belief that just because something is a certain way in nature, that's the way it ought to be. So the naturally occurring condition is good, or the status quo is good. So, so like I said, that's what the is-ought fallacy is all about. Right. And so when you apply that to this naturalistic fallacy, what that means is that people tend to have this assumption a lot of times that if something is natural, it's morally good, and if something is unnatural, that's bad for some reason. But like I said, this is a fallacy, so let's talk about exactly why that is. So there are lots of things that are naturally occurring phenomena that people generally consider kind of bad or negative. So, for example, cancer. I mean, cancer is a terrible problem that a lot of people really struggle with. It takes a lot of lives. But it's a naturally occurring phenomenon. I mean, you can get it from just walking outside and getting some exposure to sunlight can cause development of skin cancer. Murder, homicide. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that this is a natural outcropping of people's aggressive tendencies. Right? Prejudice, like racial prejudice or prejudice along the lines of religion, for example. Again, there's a lot of research, some of it a little controversial, that suggests that prejudice is a natural human tendency to fear that which is unfamiliar or different from what we're used to. But you probably wouldn't find many people that would say that things like cancer, murder, and prejudice are good. And then one last example would be, well, flesh-eating bacteria. These things are just naturally occurring phenomena, but I mean, these things can get under your skin and cause a terrible affliction. So you can see this side of it. And then there are also lots of things that are unnatural that people would consider to be good or at least morally neutral ground. So a lot of technological advancements, for example. I mean, I know lots of people today are just glued to their technology, like their smartphones, and these things do improve our lives in a lot of ways. They have their downsides too, but just because these things are artificial, you wouldn't necessarily want to say that they're bad. Right? Another example would be artificial implants, like an artificial heart valve. I actually have one of these myself. Several years ago, it was discovered that I had an infection on one of my heart valves, and it was a defective valve, so they had to do open heart surgery and put this stainless steel valve in me, and it's just ticking away in there right now. So, I mean, I'm very thankful for that. My family's very thankful for that. So I think that most people would agree that that's something that is a good thing, even though it is very much artificial. So the bottom line for this naturalistic fallacy is that you should understand that you can't use the status quo, or the idea that something is just natural, to suggest that it's morally better in some way. It's necessary to do more of an independent moral analysis, looking at the pros and cons of this phenomenon, the impact that it has on people's lives, like how much happiness it brings, how much suffering it brings, and then come to a conclusion about whether it's good or bad that way. Now, there are some controversies within psychology that can be drawn from this naturalistic fallacy. So, for example, a lot of researchers will report naturally occurring sex differences, so like sex differences in the psychology of men and women. And there are many concerns that if it's understood and agreed that these sex differences are natural, that people will say, well, there's nothing we can do about it, so they'll be used to justify inequalities within society. So these would be inequalities in like the laws regarding men and women, pay for men and women, any difference between men and women in our society. The concern, again, is that it could be justified by saying, oh, well, people are naturally different, men and women are naturally different, so it makes sense that they would be treated differently. So, again, that isn't necessarily the case. You need to determine, is it morally acceptable to treat people differently, to discriminate along the lines of sex, or is that not morally acceptable? And that's going to come back to your own moral theory that you use. So the bottom line is that just because something is natural, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Okay, so the last topic that I wanted to cover in this chapter before we get to our exam is the idea of belief perseverance. So there are just some things that seem to be pretty fundamental within human psychology. So one thing that you can see is that when it comes to people's beliefs, they love to be right and they hate to be wrong. So just think about your own interactions with other people. Whenever you've had like a dispute with somebody else, and then it turns out that you were right, that's a really good feeling. It makes you feel superior and more confident in yourself. And it's sometimes kind of fun and tempting, even though it might not be a good idea, to tell that other person that you were in disagreement with, hey, I told you so. Now, when you're on the other side of that and you realize you were wrong, or this other person says, you were wrong and I told you so, that feels kind of bad. That's a blow to your personal confidence in your beliefs. And so, what often happens is that people will cling to their beliefs, even when they're confronted with evidence that suggests that their beliefs might be incorrect. Right? So, this goes back to another thing that I might have mentioned briefly earlier in this class, which is confirmation bias. So this confirmation bias, some of you have heard of this before, but it's this tendency that people have to view evidence in a biased way that supports their existing beliefs. So if you believe that something is a certain way out in the world, you'll tend to seek out evidence that supports that belief, while at the same time ignoring evidence that contradicts your personal beliefs. And this is another reason why it's good in scientific research to have observers blind to the hypothesis of the study, because if they believe that that hypothesis is supported, then they might bias their observations in a way that would lead to collection of data that supports that hypothesis while ignoring information that might go against that hypothesis. So there's this kind of lack of objectivity that can be introduced in that type of situation. So one of the classic studies that illustrates belief perseverance was done back in the late 1970s by Lord Rawson Lepper. And so what these researchers did was they got 48 participants who either supported or opposed capital punishment, the death penalty. So about half of them supported it, half of them opposed it. And then they brought these people in and had them read 2 papers. And so these papers were analyzing the death penalty, and they came to opposite conclusions. One paper came to the conclusion that the death penalty is an effective deterrent against violent crime, that in places that have the death penalty, you're less likely to see people engaging in these violent criminal behaviors. The other paper said the opposite. It said the death penalty doesn't really seem to work to deter violent crime. And so what the researchers were interested in was they wanted to see how these people interpreted these findings and how their beliefs changed, if they did change, after they were exposed to this conflicting information. And so they had people read these papers, and then they rated the results, and they rated the procedures used to come up with these conclusions. And what they found was that if people supported the death penalty, then they believed that the paper that went along with their belief, that showed that the death penalty is an effective deterrent, was the better paper. And they kind of dismissed the other paper that went against their belief. Right? They said, well, the researchers were biased, they didn't use good methods. And likewise, if the people reading the papers opposed capital punishment, then they really liked the paper that said that the death penalty is not an effective deterrent to serious crime. And they thought that the paper that said that it was biased or flawed in some way. And in looking at how their attitudes changed in the wake of being exposed to this information, what the researchers found is that the participants' original attitude actually just got stronger. So if people started off with like a mild support for capital punishment, then after being exposed to these 2 papers, they had a stronger feeling of supporting capital punishment. If they started off mildly opposed to capital punishment, then again their original attitude got stronger and they were a little bit more opposed to it. And so this is what social psychologists refer to as attitude polarization. The more that you think about your attitude, regardless of whether you're being exposed to convincing or disconvincing information, the stronger that attitude gets. And so you would think that rationally, when people are exposed to conflicting information, like these 2 papers, they would say, well, I'm not sure about my belief anymore, because there's this bit of evidence over here that says that my belief is correct, and this other bit that says it's not correct. So maybe I shouldn't be so certain about that belief, but that usually isn't what people do. So just one last bit of advice here is to do your best to try to keep an open mind when it comes to interpreting evidence. So you might have this natural tendency to want to hold up and pay attention to evidence that supports your beliefs, but that is a bias. So one thing that can be kind of helpful with this is to try from time to time to take a different perspective. So if you can kind of play devil's advocate and argue in favor of some opposing point of view, so see if you can generate an argument in favor of a belief that you don't hold. That can be very enlightening, and it can kind of open your mind to why some people would have that belief. And furthermore, and finally, it's important to just remember that you might be wrong. We don't like to think that, but everybody is wrong from time to time, regardless of their personal intelligence or how educated they are. It happens, and so just having an attitude of humility is very important for critical thinking. All right, well, thank you very much for watching this video, and if you're in my class this semester, spring 2014, just remember that we have an exam coming up on Friday this week. So the study guide is on Blackboard. Please complete that. It's going to be very beneficial to your performance on the exam if you do. If you have any questions about that, then feel free to email me, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. If the university is open on Thursday, then I should be in my office all morning on Thursday from about 8 to noon, but we'll see what the weather does. But if there are any questions or anything about this material, please feel free to email me with those too. And I look forward to seeing you soon.